Hey everyone, I welcome you all to the Open Grand Finals of Black Eloquent 2023. Congratulations to both the teams and the judges for coming this far. My name is Angad, I'll be your chair for this Open Grand Finals. Go prefer pronouns.
Speak up.
Hi, Irene, all the best.
Hi Krishna, you guys a lot.
Hi Ram, all the best all teams.
Hello, Shriram. Good luck everyone. Few housekeeping rules before we start. Please keep your phone on mute while the speeches are going. It's very disruptive for the speakers being interrupted between their speeches. Second, please take your preferred mode of taking POIs, that is by the raise of your hand or verbally interrupting you. Cool. I think without any further ado, we can start. Prime Minister, the floor is yours. Can I take it?
I've been forced to say a lot of thank you, and that's all. First off, Angad said that it'll be tough breaking with me at a team-com. I think I'm giving another final speech to them. Last time I gave a recorded final speech from PM, it was single-handedly the worst speech I've ever given. Hopefully, I give a better speech and TTU doesn't. Thank you to everyone on that end, especially Vansh. Because last year TTU was always competing. These three won. This year one scoring. Both of the other two are still finalists. Entire TTU semis. So yeah, just a general thank you to my teammates for agreeing to team up with me 2 a.m. Just before the day of the debate. So yeah, it's a general thank you. Oh yeah, and genuinely, TTU Rada Boys and Damage Control, Pranjal Singla, best president ever. Alright. Starting my speech. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Just a clarification before we start. This debate is not it's not primarily about foreign authors, but I think we can include them as well. But I think the largest delta is created by Indian authors specifically. I'll clarify that later on why that's true. I think I'll give special reasons. 1. Why is literature important, especially in that day and age? I think in post-colonial era, written word is the most intimate way of conveying messages and it's the strongest way of recording stuff. This means that things written on paper have finality, they're solidified in history. This means whatever is written is read by people throughout the world. People are reading these things in a sense that this is what is true. They don't have multiple means of occupying what sort of media it is. This is the finality of what exists. Then I think what incentives and why exoticization looks like. It's the portrayal of something as being authentic. Doesn't necessarily mean that it is authentic. It's the portrayal that, oh, this is what this actually is. This is what authentication should be. This is what this authentic experience or an Indian is. Second, thirdly, I think what are the reasons why an Indian writer or any writer would go forward to write in English? First, I think English in and of itself is a very privileged language. People in the post-colonial era didn't have access to learning language and reading and writing, much less English. This means you're catering to a very specific audience. I'll tell you why this audience is bad. 1. I think that in the post-colonial era, Indians had some specific prerogatives to achieve. Break out of this colonial mindset that people see India from. Not be seen as a British colony, not be seen as this came under what the British ruled. They wanted to have a separate individual identity, and this is important because I think what happens when you write in English is you conform to what the British understanding of what it is. I'll prove to you why. I think authors specifically writing in English and not in Hindi are bad because they're trying to make this like media palatable to the people who can read English. This is important. I take your Q.E.D later. This is important because English is only accessible to these people. This means you have an idea of what message you're trying to convey or what you're trying to do with the story is not to like convey stories or reach to the most amount of people. It's basically to cater to a specific crowd. It's specific to people who have this access to English. I think then on you go forward and conform to what their ideas of like what an Indianness looks like. You want to show. You don't want to give them multiple culture shocks because you want to sell. You want to let your book sell and like get a lot of numbers. You want like a lot of money coming out of it. This means you don't give them constant culture shocks or what Indianness looks like. You don't give them diversity of what exists in India. There's one uniform manner under which this comes out. This means that across India, South Indians, North Indians, East Indians, West Indians conform to the idea that oh, Indians are state charmers roaming around like Mowgli in their underwears. Slumdog Millionaire means that oh, all Indians live under the slum and have to work hard to reach to the top. The entire idea of what India looks like, the entire diversity and the entire gentry is homogenized. And this is exactly what exoticization looks like. Panel, check the context. This is exactly what exoticization means. Thirdly, I think when you do not want to give this culture shock, and this conformity looks like something that these people already believe in, this cycle of affirmation, especially coming from Indian authors. Because now you see an international, like as an international person or a foreign person who doesn't know too much about India, but has a general concept of what it is from like the colonial era and what the colonial people have been telling you. An Indian author, therefore going forward affirming those ideas, centralifies it. This cements the idea that oh, this is what Indians are because the Indian is writing this story. What like reason does this person have to not tell you? This is important because now breaking this mindset becomes incredibly tough because this becomes a cycle of affirmation. These people then talk to different people, and it's important to understand who reads literature at this point of time. I think people who read literature at that point of time were specifically people who were already at the head of industry. These people were the ones controlling narratives within their society, controlling narratives within their cultural groups. This is important because now these people go forward and give the idea out to people that oh, this is what Indians are, this is what Indians do, this is what Indians look like, this is what Indians eat. It's important to give a purer idea, and I think this is the like burden they're going to push on us, and we'll be fine with it. This is the trade-off. I think we're fine with slower propagation of Indian culture if a purer form comes about in an Indian language. Because I think people and authors writing in an Indian language have less incentives to make this media as palatable to external people and give truer experiences of what the true Indian experience actually looks like, rather than like people writing in English language. It's important because I think this cementized, like how you, this idea or this narrative of what Indians look like becomes cemented into the minds of these people over time. This looks like future generations living in a world where these ideas have constantly been come about and then told that, oh, this is what Indians look like. There are large folding harms of this. I'll come to that later.
Yeah.
One, I take it. Indians outside India, or I think Indians even existing within India, who don't conform to this idea of what Indianness looks like, get dismissed as not being Indian enough. This means their idea of what truly being Indian is to them never becomes like, I don't think they look for validation, I think they just like become constantly dismissed from people. They're saying that, oh, you're not a true Indian because you're not dancing like balle balle. Oh, you're not a true Indian because you're not having butter chicken. This idea is bad because this is exactly how we all have grown up. Santa Banda jokes is how we originally got acquainted to what Punjabis look like. I go and see Angad, I say, oi, Paji, this is bad. This is what idea comes about. This is the idea of affirmation that goes about in the minds of people. This is how future generations cement the idea of what Indianness looks like. And this, I think, it's irreversible because this gets normalized across time. And since no counter narrative exists, because I'll prove to you that publishers themselves then disincentivize Indian writers. At the point of time, English writing is doing so well, publishers don't have any incentive to push forward Indian writings or the true Indian experiences because that's what's getting you the numbers, that's what's getting you the money. It's bad because now the truer Indian experience gets diminished. You get overshadowed by the English experience, what it means to be like an Indian person. It's bad because now the Indian people who wanted to truly express themselves while they're writing never get the opportunity to because publishers die up, like stop giving them the chances to do so. It's bad because now the English conforming identity and it's like the diversity across India never gets represented because everyone wants to tap into that idea of what Indianness is. This means you never wanting to do that culture shock that oh, I'm actually a South Indian, I'm not eating butter chicken, I'm having a dosa for breakfast. That never comes about because that that idea for a foreign person to understand becomes so vague and like uncomprehensive that you don't want them to do, because you're not able to achieve anything out of that. So you tap into this same narrative existing and you go forward and play into this narrative that, oh, we're all a homogenized country and this is what we all look like. Things that you have to do. One, I think why this internal fighting for what Indianness looks like is a good thing, because at a point of time, everyone's conforming to this, literature in and of itself becomes homogenized. The portrayal of India across time gets cemented as something that's like conforming to what the international identity wants it to be. You never, as an Indian nation, break out of that British colonial mindset of what everyone sees. That you see the snake charmers who exist in this country only to like sing weird tales of like
what does exoticization of Indianness essentially look like on our side of the house to begin with? One, we think so that essentially looks like platforming and displaying things which are innate experiences of being an Indian in general to begin with. That essentially looks like that looks like different things. How post-colonially, like spatially goes ahead and dates back to like centuries back of how life was before, say, India was a British colony, how things were before that at all points in time, the siege lifestyle that India has, the history that it goes ahead and draws back to that particular era in general to begin with, but also goes ahead and talks about stuff like experiences that people have within the colonial era that they essentially goes ahead and shares with different kind of people in general to begin with. That can look like how rich landowners experienced during a partition, or people who were forced to work in like British administration, what their life felt like, how that led to like differentiation in their life in general, how like most vulnerable people experience the kind of instances that happened in like the Jallianwala Bagh instance and stuff like that, but can also talk about stuff like say Mahabharata, Ramayana, the fantasy world, folklore in general, going ahead and showing like animals talking and going ahead and relating it back to the kind of history and culture that we have in like different religious instances in general to begin with. The argument is pretty simple. We think so that it essentially means that it can go ahead and showcase any person, be it rich or poor, from any socio-economic background, going ahead and showcasing any kind of experience, any kind of emotion, just going ahead and giving a sense of Indianness and the kind of experience that they share during that particular context at all points in time to begin with. But secondarily, what's the comparative on top? We think so that the comparative on top is not going ahead and not writing in English, because that was literally clarification, but this is something which is largely symmetric. That is to say, writings in English exist symmetrically. The debate is then about what form of content that do you produce, what kind of writing do you produce in that particular instance. What do you produce on that side of the house to begin with? One, we think so that this kind of content is likely, like the English content that they produce, is likely going to be influenced by some foreign writers that exist with like who are pre-established within Western countries at all points in time. That looks like Mary Shelley, Oscar Wilde, and people like that. But second, going ahead and talking about say tales of family and industrial revolution, World War II, etc., drawing some kind of inspiration from those kind of stories and those kind of content that was created in the Western era during in English in general to begin with. That is to say, inspiration drawn from predominantly existing and established content that has already been existing at all points points in time. To begin with, what's the likelihood analysis of this particular comparative existing? Why Indian literature in English essentially exists on their side of the house as well, right? One, we think so that this debate is essentially about whether exoticization of Indianness should be there or not the fact that they are opposing the Indian literature in English in and of itself. Even if you don't buy that, we think so why is that symmetric? One, we think so British introduced English language, English education, meaning people went to schooling, goes ahead there and they are exposed to dominant English structures at all points in time to begin with. But secondarily, we think so that more awards like Nobel Prize in Literature or Booker's Prize are always given to writers who go ahead and write in English by virtue of having some kind of systemic biases and the people who go ahead and hold the position of power there. Insofar as that is the case, we think so writers generally have some sense of aspirational value when you see, say, Rabindranath Tagore going ahead and getting a Nobel Prize in Literature for Gitanjali. We think so that English writing largely becomes symmetric by virtue of them having some sense of inspirational and aspirational value that they have. But thirdly, we think so there's some sense of general awareness about English being predominant language, thereby many people adapted to that particular language. Even if their comparative stands, and even if their comparative is true, that you go ahead and write in Indian language, why is that still bad on a comparative to begin with? One, we think so that the strongest way of going ahead and binding Indians out on a post-colonial era is to go ahead and shouldn't be in a language that is more divided to them at all points in time to begin with. That is to say, we think so that post-colonial era, India is already more and more fragmented by virtue of the policies that were used by British and by virtue of the differentiation that was created by the British at large to begin with. Why is that true, right? Why do you not want to create that sort of fragmentation that is going to happen on their side of the house? One, we think so that British use divide and rule, thereby this large contextual gap that essentially exists between people living in, say, North India and people living in, say, South India at all points in time to begin with. But second, we think so that there's some sense of aggression that people generally have in terms of differentiation in that kind of language. That is to say, there were already protests going ahead and talking about how you want to have a state predominantly based on languages, i.e. how do you want, say, Tamil Nadu based on people only speaking Tamil, and how do you have some Maharashtra based on people only speaking Marathi. At that point in time, we think so that kind of fragmentation exasperates on their side of the house. To begin with, if you go ahead and create literatures going ahead and talking about experiences only of those people in general, to begin with, we think so literature often is a way to go ahead and break cultural barrier. If that information is restricted to, say, local language, it creates more fragmentation and creates more local language divide at all points in time to begin with. But secondarily, why is it better? There are better outcomes for, say, writers and viewers on our side of the house to begin with. One, when you introduce a new segment in a market, it's likely going to be successful insofar as you go ahead and exoticize Indianness within English language. Why is that true, right? One, we think so that this is an unexplored market at all points in time. Thereby, some sense of curiosity is in the minds of the readers to go ahead and explore and understand those kind of content that is going ahead and coming up. But second, we think so that the amount of content that essentially exists is something which is significantly vast by virtue of you having, say, different kind of contexts that you can go ahead and subscribe to within the Indian context in general to begin with. That is to say, India has vast diversity, thereby you have complex and intriguing past, and you can go ahead and come up with newer content significantly on our side of the house to begin with. There's no repetitive content. We think so that you can go ahead and create USP in terms of the different stakeholders and contexts that you can create on our side of the house by virtue of going ahead and having some sense of exoticization of Indianness in general. But thirdly, we think so that people generally want to consume newer and newer content by virtue of, say, DMU, how they don't want to have diminishing marginal utility. We think so insofar as you go ahead and only consume and draw inspirational value from, say, Western content and using it in your Indian context, we think so that generally becomes bad because there's always a reference point that people can go ahead and establish and check through. Conclusion of this argument is pretty simple. We think so that there's a big benefit to writers, primarily because they have greater market capitalization on our side of the house to begin with. Why is the comparative worse? One, there are already set standards of Western writing, thereby there's lack of epistemic access for you to evaluate that kind of understanding that those Western writers have. But secondarily, we think so those stories already exist. You don't have to create a unique understanding within the market in general. These things are generally consumed more on our side of the house. Impact is pretty simple. One, you get more money, more money flows through this in the Indian literary circle. But second, you have more content. But third, we think so that it's consumed more outside India as well by virtue of the language that you go ahead and use and the kind of content that you go ahead and create. That is to say, niche stories are valued by literary organization at all points in time. When you specifically showcase stories of exoticization of Indianness, we think so they value the content and they value that art by virtue of the diversity that you go ahead and create. But secondly, even for viewers, we think so that it acts as a counter narrative to the version of India that has been pushed forward by the Western writers at all points in time. It always acts as a counter narrative to push forward for how this is much more of an accurate content and accurate representation in comparison to what has been established by those Western writers in general. More on that by the second.
You guys, after 5, sign. This is important. You guys after 5. You got memorized. Just say it. And I want more tabs. Yeah, also like I was supposed to give shout outs as well. Shout out to Bunch for covering this document. Shout out to all people from DTU and extended family of DTU, Robin, Lavanya, and shout out to Sai as well shout out to Sai as well for being like a worthy opponent, probably the most fun matchup I've had in this tournament, and shout out to both of you for like calling me out of debates. I don't think it was that, but anyway, for consecutive debate for 7 days now, so I hope I can take a break afterwards. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Lavanya's one last minute of how DMU applies means that you can still sell exotic, authentic Indian literature on our side of the house because people are generally bored of this. So I think they just make out our claim of how if you even write in your local language, it will sell because people are just generally bored of whatever is written in English and appropriation. I think they just make out the entire claim on our side of the house, right? Secondly, they say that information is restricted between cultures. I don't understand, and this is a problem that I have with the entire case. They never tell us why English becomes the tipping point for you to bridge those gaps between multiple cultures. So I don't understand why a Punjabi can go ahead and just understand South Indian culture through English itself. Why you can't just like translate those things directly? And like I think we can just claim that translation probably exists on our side of the house. I think, but people are generally aware this thing is translated and not something that you have authentically written in English in the first place. That's the difference. You can probably go ahead and send the same kind of stuff outside, but I don't understand why uniquely writing in English becomes the tipping point for you to go ahead and bridge access information access at any point of time. But then they say that it's like there are large hegemonization by English writers over Indian literature in the first place. I think that's generally bad in of itself, and that like so falls into our claim of how you need a counter narrative to the hegemonization of defining English writer in the first place, right? That's exactly why you need authentic experiences through in local language to counterbalance the kind of market hegemony that these English writers have already created at any point of time. But then they say that you can show your life before Britishers and you can show the stage life, vulnerable people and folklore. But not if you write in English, you're already diluting that thing to a great extent. The reason for that is that you don't want to cause cultural shock to people who don't have like similar lived experiences. So if you show like the kind of violence that partition had, you probably will write it in English in a much more mellowed down format so that the people within the West can consume it. You won't talk about the multiple bloodshed, mass amounts of bloodshed that happened between borders or how like ethnic violence is perpetuated by things like assaults and stuff like that, right? Because you don't want to create that sort of shock in the first place, because that means that people don't readily buy into you, and there's like a high threshold they have to meet in order for them to not feel triggered by it or just be offended by the kind of Gregorian graphic language that's generally used within like local expressions. I think when most Indian writers generally think in their local languages, that's how we all are hardwired, and I think it's the truest form of self-expression if you can put that out in the final form of literature, as opposed to opting into like English, which is largely like enforced onto you and largely a privileged concept because most people don't understand English in post-colonial states. I think generally what is our case and why don't they engage with the three therapies that three arms that we did. Firstly, it's Orientalism, right? The idea is very simple. When you go ahead and like when Oriental people or like people from the West, they start talking about the difference between West and East, and they say that there's an inherent power disparity between West and East, and like people from the East are largely like say Chawla and stuff like that. I think when Indian authors start writing it authentically in English, and it's not a translation, if you start writing in English authentically, what you do is you validate or legitimize the kind of power imbalances that exist within these nations, right? That means whatever Oriental writers are writing or have hegemonized on both sides of the house,
house, that validation only comes about when they also see Indian writers writing the same thing that they were writing. I think that means that they never have any incentives to break out of that bubble. Even if like DMU applies and they want to go and sell their books more, I think they still have incentives on our side of the house to change or like find more authentic experiences, maybe even visit India and take people's like live, like, I don't know, the testimonies and stuff like that. But they don't have that incentive on their side of the house because you really legitimize the kind of things that they're already writing in the first place, right? This means you probably have things large scale homogenization and cultural appropriation on their side of the house by the certain writers. Second, overshadowing. This is very simple, right? By their own definition, if I were to take at the best that this is most palatable, I think more people buy into the thing that they're easily ready to get opt into. They don't have to take an effort to go and translate those things into their local languages. If English is the most easily accessible language to a large amount of people, it tends to overshadow the kind of things that other authors writing in the local language will. What this means that you can probably never go ahead and access the kind of information that exists truly within these communities. That means the lived experiences are largely overshadowed by what was homogenized narrative you want to push onto them. But this has multiple implications. This means people from local languages necessarily have to conform to this in the first place because they now know that this is the hot selling thing. That I have to write about Punjabis in a certain way for me to sell this particular book because that's what people outside want to see. Because that's what reaffirms the kind of beliefs they have. I think that means that you all points of time, you don't have any ability to go ahead and move around or self-express in a way that's more meaningful to you or what's more true to you. Rather, you just opt into what's readily available. That means you conform more and rather you lose out the ability to self-express at that point of time. Third, and this is the most important thing, the cycle of affirmation. I think this has been sufficiently proven by Shashwat about how people go ahead and have a certain perception about Indians, and if you write the same thing, then a belief itself gets even more strengthened. So I think what you now have is an even stronger incentive to write the same things. That means it's a cycle of affirmation that like the consumers and the writers have with each other, and that means they'll always go ahead and keep on producing the same kind of content. This has multiple implications. Firstly, it legitimizes the kind of stereotypes that you have. The pragmatic implication is very simple. Whenever you see an Indian, you want that particular Indian to conform to model Indian standards of what they have rendered and what they have perceived you to be. That means you always want a South Indian to have a dosa or you always want a Punjabi to have butter chicken. I think that's generally bad because it forces people to conform to those standards and it like pushes immense amounts of burden onto these individuals to go ahead and conform to the standards, and that's generally taking away the dignity that these people probably have. Future generations grow up in an age where you probably will all have mostly homogeneous content and they probably cannot ever find the identity that their parents belong to. That means the lack of relatability that they have with older generations always means that there's only cultural gap and generational gap between these two kind of groups. That means you never have any sort of relatability, and that's generally bad for these people at any point of time. Before going on any given.
Isn't it true on your side that Western writers have already caricatured Indians enough? So if there's a Punjabi stereotype that's already in the market, for me as a local writer to create differentiation, I need to be not so stereotypical.
Exactly. So if you feel that the Western people who have written down the same Punjabi culture and is selling in market, you probably will write the same thing because you want to. Now the idea becomes that the Indians writing the same thing, it sells more because that is the thing that's already selling. You want to jump on the bandwagon as opposed to creating a distinction. Because if you create a distinction, I think it's very difficult for you to go ahead and like counterbalance that thing. At least on our side, when you write in the local language, people know that you're coming from a place of honesty and not something that you're conformed to. That means that it can act as one narrative on our side of the house, but not on their side of the house, right? Note the capacity for people to go ahead and do that. Often do this self-expression of true like on our side. It's very simple, right? I think people want to always make a larger community around themselves, so they write like in their local languages, so that they can have more people relate with them within the local language that they are from. I think this leads to creation of a larger community because you can spread your story and your true experiences outside. But also, I think you also always want to get into counter narrative, right? That's something that people have incentive for, because now if everything in the market is like really homogenized and culturally appropriated, you want to like create a niche space for yourself. This is their own analysis of DMU, right? At that point, the counter narrative probably works and also sells because of their own analysis of how people are generally just tired of those kind of things. And on our side of the house, these people are probably not aware that you can create that niche for yourself. On their side or on their side of the house. On our side, you probably know that you can create that market for yourself if you write in a way that's more true to you and represents yourself in the best possible manner for all those reasons.
shout out first. Shout out to DQ for. There are so many things that I'd have to thank them for if I start. So, shout out to Lunch for everybody and for being there always. Shout out to Angad, Pranjal, because they are also being on this journey with me together. Shout out to Shashwat for not being annoying for once, and shout out to my teammates for just doing this tournament with me. And it's always fun with Robin and Lavanya. I think everyone is on board with us. Starting in 3.
एक सेकंड रुक जाओ.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. First the comparative, then Shashwat and Angad's speech, then what will Lavanya. They say that Lavanya has met out all of their claims, that this is a DMU means by local markets comparative. But they don't realize they are debating a separate debate. The market for local markets is incredibly small because the number of people who write, read and acknowledge in those local cultures is incredibly small. Why? Because India is such a diverse and fragmented country at any given point of time. So you can keep all your benefits, but they're capped after a maximum extent. We don't think you have the time, like benefits insulated by time, you can have them in the short run. I don't care, it still loses to us. But on the comparative that they want to establish about Hindi versus English, if Shashwat's opening lines are true, that this is a sense of finality and the inherent meaning or the importance of postcolonial is that you want to collapse distinctions or boundaries that were keeping you shackled before. We think the kind of messaging should not be very insulated from each other. The kind of literature that you produce on your side of the house is more fragmented. Why? Lavanya already tells you the way that the British ruled us, that is divide and rule. That is to say, instead a sense of cultural superiority, but also a fear of how other cultures might perceive you. So when you want to translate these ideas onto a sheet of paper, we think the way in which you often do it is defensive, the way in which you often do it is as extreme as Angad points out in their speech. At that given point of time, we think those kind of narratives are far worse because they fragment people a lot. I acknowledge that on our side of the house, you might be gentrified in some instances, but I think there is a myth in APM speech itself as to why can't those works be used as reference points for teaching in classrooms? Why can't those works be discussed in literary circles after 6 p.m. in in a DU classroom and things like that? At that point of time, we think translation can exist symmetrically, dissemination of information can exist symmetrically. It's the way that your stories are written, which are culturally locked from each other. We think that parallel and common ground is still okay on our side of the house. But even in that best case, we think they cap the market size and they fragment people in such a way that it defeats the purpose of having post-colonial literature and literature at such a crucial time. Secondly, then, I think their biggest claim, this is that what I gather from all 2 speeches, is that these kinds of things are hard on stereotype, and specifically when Angad says that, look, you will have to conform to this because you want to enter the same market. I think the assumption is that markets are static and that people's preferences don't evolve over time. I can't read the same telltale of a Punjabi and a Madras, Tamilian going to a bar and having a drink and things like that. What happens when you abridge? What happens when you adapt? What happens when you retell? To draw some inspiration from that, because you still need to have a starting point for someone picking up the book, but ultimately you change. Ultimately you delineate your course, because those are legacy intensives that are entrenched in everyone, like the individuals. We think you need to be differentiated in order to be not called the same person, because otherwise you live in the shadow of that individual. Otherwise you will be called an Indian, dollar store ripoff of that individual at any given point of time. We think there's value addition that people want to integrate, because that's what makes people finish the books, even if they end up picking the book because there was a Punjabi celebrating and drinking on the cover page of the book. We think the ways in which adaptation and bridging work is the mechanism that takes out all of their 2 speeches. But I'll take your best case. Let's assume I write a book that was written by a Westerner and I write the same stereotypes again and again. We think, at best, this will work in the short run. But after a point of time, I will be typecast and I will be called out by my immediate structures, people who debate in debate rooms, people who set motions and criticize these kinds of things. There are self-regulating mechanisms that can tell you that you suck, brother, that you suck, this is not the way that you create literature, this is not the way that you perpetuate knowledge and ideas. So at best, I can have my 15 seconds of fame, but it'll have to change in the long run. I'll have to change the way that I go in the first place at any given point of time. But the third thing on the comparative, right? We think it's them who has to go ahead and write stories which are far removed from the Indian context. And why? Note, this is a definitional, not a definitional debate, but a very contextualization heavy debate. And that's why you see the extensive characterization in Lavanya as to what encompasses the specific thing and what does not. That is to say, you can draw anything or any Indian connotation out of a lot of instances. A rich Bengali landowner who was alive in 1905 in Curzon, like partition Bengal, or a South Indian like who had to, for some reason, like fly from Pakistan to India after partition or things like that. It can be magical realism. All that we are saying is that you push the exoticization part at any given point of time. And why is that important? We think in the absence of exoticization, it is difficult for you to create a space for yourself. That is to say, when you have some specific connotations that can only be attached to you, at any given point of time, people relate that solely with you. And because people seek authentic experiences, we think people are more likely to go ahead and pick up your books. But what happens after a point of time? We think that this motion is not stagnant. That is to say, these people will not practice this lifelong, but the way that their writing then evolves is going to be like their writing is bound to evolve. Why? Because there will be other kind of influences around them that tell them and like repeat them and all those kind of things. That means at any given point of time, in the long run, these kinds of things self-regulate themselves. Why do we have more writers? Why do we have more money for that?
The market regulates itself in long term in any way or form. You have to concede to the short term harm, reinforce stereotypes to that extent that people can't break out of that generationally. That means all your cases literally just market analysis that exists on both sides.
You have to be in the market to break out of it. We are the only thing that's in the market. You are not willing to write in English. I don't realize that how we are operating on the same frame. You want to cap the market and then you want to say we also evolve. I don't think how those two things can operate together at any given point of time. We have two basic things on our side of the house. We have more literature that's created and we have more money that's transferred to these people. Why do we simply have more literature? When people see that you can pick a niche and delineate in the ways that you want, once you start off at a stereotypical entry point, people think this is accessible at any given point of time. But secondly, when people see that there is global recognition in the market which exclusively acknowledges these kinds of things, we think people are more bound to go ahead and explore these kinds of things at any given point of time. We think the money aspect of things is far better on our side of the house. Why is money incredibly important? It's incredibly important for setting up institutions at your own local regions in terms of grassroots development, developing literary circles, and all those kinds of things. But lastly then, I think what they need to prove in this debate is simple. Firstly, in the absence of exoticization, if it is cultural stories that you want to tell in your local culture, why will people ever have the ability to break out of it? Because presumably after 10 to 15 years, when nationalistic fervors have gone down, people are more accepting and more accessible of English. Why won't things change then? But secondly, we tell you on the comparative that it is you who has to go ahead and defend a very foreign nature of tale telling. On our side of the house, you have a lot of context to play with, so you have far more leeway in terms of how you want to evolve your story and things like that. For all those.
Whatever you do for a tournament, for being there always. Thank you to Sai for just being with me throughout this entire journey through pretty bad phases of life. Angad and Shashwat, best teammates ever. More power to present teams. And for that, DTU, so proud of all of you. So happy to see you grow in the circuit and just extremely happy to see all of these things happening. Slightly nervous in the first final. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, note crucially, this debate doesn't happen in long term. I'm going to clarify to you why those long-term mechanisms of DMU and just generally discourse happening exist on both of the sides. They have to go and engage with the short-term harms that happen on their side of the house and how exoticism is something that's so important for market entry and why is that the tipping point and more people knowing about the culture in the wrong way, something that's more important than it being in the pure form. Let's understand why DMU is likely to work on our side of the house as well and why you just have more discourse anywhere on our side. If you want to go ahead and push that people go ahead and publish more books or different kinds of books because DMU exists to read different kinds of books, we think we can simply counter this out and say that DMU happens on our side of the house as well, which means people can go ahead and just publish more books in their own local language. Different experiences of different individuals exist within these local languages or switch local languages if they choose to because they want to go ahead and cater to DMU market. Which means this debate is primarily about market entry, which they have to go ahead and deal with, and how the market entry as a mechanism is something that's generally bad for all the harms that we've given you so far. So now the crucial idea is that the point at which you go ahead and enter a market, you're able to go ahead and create discourse in society, i.e. you're able to go ahead and tell the Indian perspective. We don't think the perspective is largely Indian, simply because we're likely to go ahead and conform to standards set by Western actors. Why is that the case? We think this generally is how market functions, i.e. the thing that sells is probably what I want to go ahead and publish more. Within publisher incentives work in that way, right? Which means if this book is or the ideas in this book, the projection of Indianness within this book is something that's largely read by people, I'm likely to go ahead and publish those same books because I see that probably, just on probabilistic basis, there's something that's going to be picked up by more number of people. Which means my ability as a writer who writes in local languages to go ahead and talk about my authentic experiences significantly decreases on their side of the house because A, there is no market for me to be able to publish that simply because Indian writers writing in English have gone ahead and monopolized that market, which means market entry for me as a local writer writing in local languages becomes extremely difficult. Secondly, we think in general, the kind of experiences you project are not true to your Indian essence. Why do you think that projecting experiences truest to Indian essence is something that's very, very important? We think the harm that happens on their side of the house, the point at which the Indian experience is homogenized, as clarified by the cap, we think what happens is that you're likely to go ahead and project experiences in a certain manner that conform to Western ideas. What happens is the kind of stereotypes that then pushed upon you in Western countries or by Western actors is largely undoable, which means it's very, very difficult for me to go ahead and question those stereotypes in the first place. It requires a lot of capital for me to be able to go ahead and undo the harms of the stereotypes that have been pushed by society on me. We think on the other hand, even if it takes time on us in the house to be able to push out pure narratives about Indian experiences in post-colonial era, we'll find that trade-off because we think it's truest to its essence, which means the point which is actually realized by most number of people. We think they're likely to go ahead and just we're able to go ahead and identify with it better, which means my generations are able to go ahead and understand what my experiences actually were as opposed to what the anglicized version of it looks like in the first place. Which means in general we're able to go ahead and express lived experiences on our side of the house better simply because they're extremely pure in nature and don't tamper with what people were actually thinking at that point in time. Which means the idea of market entry is largely out of this debate because it's very, very difficult to go ahead and reverse the harms caused on their side of the house. I think that is the tipping point in this debate. Because the bare minimum what we're able to do is provide people true Indian experiences. But largely the idea is that the point at which you have localized writers are likely to be restricted to local markets. We think that's fine because either idea is that the point at which more and more people read English, they're likely to go and have conversations. We think English is largely an elite language, specifically in post-colonial eras. We think it's restricted to the elite class, which means the ideas, interactions, etc. happen only in the elite class. It never flows down. Which means most people who are probably poor, who don't have access to languages like India, languages like English, are never able to access that literature in the first place. Which means their idea of Indian is something that's largely lost in the world. We think we invalidate those lived experiences on their side of the house. Lastly, then, we think at all points in time, even if there are smaller markets, even if you're writing in your own language and lesser number of people read it, we think it's still better because we think discourse can still happen on our side of the house as well. We think people can go ahead and understand, if the idea is that people are so academically motivated to go ahead and discuss literature in debate rooms, we think they can simply go ahead and discuss literature written in different languages as well. It's why it's so interested in literature on our side of the house as well. We just think discourse can happen on our side of the house as well. Note crucially that the discourse that they talk about literally has no impact, which means whatever the writer is writing probably never changes because note crucially, writers will constantly write books, which means my ideas of post-colonial experiences are probably restricted to 1 or 2 books, which means I'm not going to go ahead and continue writing books for the rest of my life, which means in general, the kind of impact that they talk about in the writer becoming better and selling just better books significantly decreases on the rest of the house.
Yeah, so if you concede to the fact that translation can happen symmetrically, why are you exactly saying that this is restricted to the gender?
2 reasons, right? A, we think the point at which translation happens of the anglicized version of your lived experiences, the translation is likely to be also reflective of what the Western ideas or the Indian anglicized version of Indianness actually looks like. Which means my interaction with that translated literature vastly outweighs whatever they've said so far in this debate. We think most people are able to go ahead and record history or record lived experiences through literature. What does that mean? We think literature is a formal or final or permanent account of what has happened to you in the past. If most people access your past through a version that is created for someone else or for someone else who would palliative with or understanding of your culture, we think that's generally bad for all the people who have experienced negative harms, which means all Lavanya's ideas of who you go ahead and talk about within these within these pieces of literature, the people who suffered in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, etc., are invalidated because you never go ahead and talk about their individual lived experiences, but rather what Westerners perceive their lived experiences are likely to be. Why do we think then that there is a significant difference in the kind of burden they're pushing on us? We don't think these pieces are likely to be taken by foreign actors or the house. Multiple reasons for that, right? A, we think people are likely to go ahead and believe or buy into the narrative of an Indian writing, an organized version, more and likely to believe that that is something that's true as opposed to a foreign actor going ahead and writing about the similar experiences. Because we think if audiences are so intelligent, they're likely to go ahead and differentiate on this basis in and of itself. We think generally they're just better off because they're able to create more writers, create more market for local writers, but more importantly, we promote cross-cultural relations in and of itself as well, right? Which means the idea of overshadowing and of generally people within the country being able to identify with different cultures significantly increases on us in the house. Because the idea is to want to go and educate people on cultures, on by discussion, discourse. But that's better served because now you're able to go and communicate with people on their local languages, which means if I want to understand the Punjabi culture, the person that needs to probably go ahead and understand what has been written, which means I'm able to have to go and translate text, which is generally interactions between different communities become significantly better. Doesn't happen on their side of the house as well. So what then does all has to do in this debate to be able to win? A, they have to prove or deal with the short-term harms that are largely irreversible in nature to be able to win. They never do that for their speech, but also they have to tell us why is marketing to the tipping point in this debate. And so I will prove to you, DMU market over arching market narratives still exist on the side of the house very
Hello everyone, this is Robin doing opposition big, no pronoun preference. If you want to take one post fifth, just raise your hand, don't say anything. Only shout out to Juggernaut because that is where Lavanya and I go there to have dosa and our team name is Illuminati. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The strongest claim from their side is that you should write in Hindi. But you can't draw a comparative by something should happen. Rather, you have to give incentive mechanisms in regards to why it will happen. Why you won't have incentives to write in local dialects. Here are 4 structural reasons for this. A. Local dialects in India are so many, and India is a very diverse country. Every niche becomes so small. This means you don't have the enough market share for you to earn revenue if you're actually operating in just one dialect. Because you don't have the big market for that to begin with. The second reason is revenue from writing is generally very difficult because A, it is an unconventional form of earning revenue and it's not a conventional thing like engineering, etc. But two, to tap into the interest of people and to sell it, writing in general, to sell it is generally very difficult. The third mechanism is you can't have lots of content because oftentimes people speaking one language have similar shared experiences of the colonial past. This means the cap at which your uniqueness comes very early. So the idea is that you can't come up with a lot of content because people speaking with one local language have some experience. So maybe you can come up with 2 stories of that experience, and then when the cap comes, you can't come up with new ideas. The fourth response to this is that foreign markets are just outside your scope because they don't understand local languages, Bengali, etc. The conclusion of this argument is that you need a big market base. Insofar as you probably don't have writers, and that is the true comparative. Because I think that Pranjal is right. Pranjal explains that you should write in Hindi, you should write in local languages, but this debate is not about should. You have to give incentive reasons. There are 0 incentives from our side and a lot of incentives. You don't have incentives. I think we clearly know that. The impact is you don't have writers. Only a few writers exist. This space is in explode. This is the biggest impact on scale. Angad will say in the reply speech that many people do not know English, so in our side we also don't have writers. Except Lavanya explains to you that many people have learned English because these British people existed for so many years. They introduced English education in school. This means people have literally come out of school having learned English. But two, businesses have started English. This means the trend has actually started in terms of generally talking about this to begin with, right? But secondly, I think the second biggest argument is that appropriation can happen, and you will do this as per Western standards. Other examples about dosa and about like the Punjabi culture, right? I think they have one good reason to explain this. They say you jump onto the bandwagon of the West because this is something which is tried and tested. Here are so many counter reasons for that. A, unexplored markets have high levels of curiosity. New content is something which people want. This means you can probably do this. You can't accept new content in local language does not work because you don't have that market for that. I'm talking about new content in terms of ideas, so that does not make sense. Two, if it is true that people will get pissed from a homogeneous depiction as per Shashwat's framing, this is an incentive to cater to all, so you probably don't go for the homogenization if people will be pissed. The third reason is, in writing, you need USPs, you need new ideas. Meaning you tap into the diversity which India provides to you. This means you probably just don't go with the Santa Banta jokes. You probably give a new lens to take also what the Punjabi culture holds, because that is why you can create a USP out of this. The fourth reason is that markets are ever evolving and adaptive in regards to science explanation. Therefore, we think your ability to come up with more nuanced ideas and not appropriate things generally exists. The problem with their side is that they assume only uniform form of writing will come. We explain is that people can have different kind of USPs. So there will be some writers who may appropriate because that's probably some rhetoric, and some writers who won't misappropriate. The weighing of this argument is pretty simple. In the context of a post-colonial setting, you are more acceptable towards change because you just got free. Markets are getting new. The idea of democracy is also new. So your psyche is generally more accepting towards newer forms of writing because everything is literally new to begin with. But lastly, notice this debate about English versus Hindi, right? To win this clash, they had to explain why you can't have both of them coexistence. If the idea is true that a market exists, so why can't you have writers who write in Hindi and why can't you have writers who write in English? And then you don't need to translate, primarily because you can just have Hindi writings of Mahabharata and you probably translate towards the English from that Hindi writing on that. So you also have to prove that coexistence can't happen. You never did that. I don't think the binary is English versus Hindi. Lastly, what is the biggest impact in this debate? That is the idea of more literature, which we explain only exists on our side. What is the value of that? The benefit of this is more people sharing experiences. The way writing happens is to ask people for experiences, to take feedbacks. More people have an avenue to speak up. This is the biggest cathartic experience for a lot of people. But two, this profession gets more buying as the revenue stream is there. Therefore, more people are generally able to actually get on the act of writing. Thirdly, there's more knowledge sharing happens. This is good because general decision making happens better. Opinions are formed better with more knowledge points. You have more knowledge points by virtue of generally more literature existing on our side to begin with it. But lastly, what is the urgency thing in this round? The urgency thing in this round is the idea of unification. Because Lavanya tells you is that the country is divided in terms of divided rule policies. So you actually need unification. If their comparative is true, you go for localized languages, then there is no point of unification. What this means is the country continues to be divided on the idea of languages to begin with. We think this and Angad response is that why is English the tipping point? The reason is pretty simple because it's the most dominant language in that point in time, but two, people are generally aware about the value English holds in terms of businesses are done in English, etc., etc. That is the why a lot of administrative frameworks literally changed towards English after all of this colonial period to begin with. Sure, it's good to live in a world where Hindi is the dominant language, but you just have to live with the reality to begin with that. But lastly, what is the true binary of this debate? I think the idea of this debate is to oppose the exoticization of Indianness in literature written in English. Their burden was not to say is that English writing is bad, but the exoticization in English writing is bad. Meaning, English writing is probably symmetrical on both sides. Here are a few reasons for the same to begin with. The first funny reason is that I asked Prabhav if this binary is English versus Hindi. He said no, and Gunjan is on cap, so we all know that Prabhav is right. But here are structural reasons for the same. The structural reasons Lavanya gives you is that because British has introduced English education, you always know that there is a market for the same. But two, most awards like Booker Prize and Nobel Prize are written in English. What this means is people have aspiration to write in English. The third is that there is always an awareness about English being the dominant language. The conclusion to this argument is pretty simple. That is to say, is that the binary is not English versus Hindi, because the entire case is that writing in English is bad. We think that completely goes out of the window. Therefore, writing in English is actually symmetric. Lastly, what are the benefits that we actually give to you? The first benefit of exoticization is that they give to you is a counter narrative to what the true Indian experience is. Because all the literature that exists in terms of what is it to be an Indian is there by writers from the West. We think now Indian writers are telling in regards to what the true experience is, and they have a sense of relativity to that, to give a counter narrative to the rest of the world in regards to what true India is actually breaking stereotypes, then continuing with the story stereotypes. Because they had to give what the incentive of a particular person to continue with the stereotype, given that they don't themselves relate to the stereotype, because they themselves be the particular person who don't like to be differentiated as per Shashwat's speech. Right. The second thing to say here is the idea of people feeling validated. People feel validated by giving and sharing their experiences, primarily because the trauma of the colonial oppression is very recent. So it's good to actually share their experience. But lastly, in terms of relatability, many people can generally talk about what is it to what was it in regards to my experience. In the end, the reason to give this debate to us is because we explain is that there's no incentive for you to do localized language, etc., etc. They never proved that there's a market for that. And lastly, even because exoticization leads to so many benefits for viewers and also for the market, therefore the most proximate benefit to writers, because they are the ones who actually impact the most. All the people.
With this being the constructive part of our debate, moving on to design, I call for like to summarize the paper.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Two clashes. One on counter narratives, one on market, money, revenue, all of that. Firstly on counter narratives. This comes very clearly in Shashwat's speech, and if I as a Tamilian go ahead and write and affirm a stereotype, it creates a cycle of those affirmations. But the assumption is something that we flag out. I can only rely on this cycle insofar the profit continues to come to me. When I say that people are grow tired of this same thing being repeated again and again, when I say that there is an alternative Western idea or person who has already caricatured and milked this to the fullest extent, then I don't really see why it's in my benefit to go ahead and continue that cycle of affirmations. That means even if one instance of it happens, we think in the long run it changes. You realize that you have to adapt a bridge and retell in a different way for people people to continue buying your books and for people to complete reading your book rather than just picking it up. But secondly, they say that even one instance is bad because it continues to legitimize this stereotype. We say on the comparative, we are the only ones who have the capacity to break the stereotype by first adopting it and then reshaping it in ways, recontextualizing it in the ways that Lavanya has told you. This can be anything, right? That's why it's so broad what the context of exoticization of Indianness can mean at any given point of time. That means we are the only side who has a channel of creating counter narratives on that side of the house, because note the delta. If I don't do this, like if one instance is bad, how in the absence of that one instance of affirmation do you change anything on your side of the house? There is no one telling people who are foreign authors as to why this is bad or as to why this can't sell at any given point of time. So if you want to reframe the way that Indian literature is perceived, that can only happen on our side of the house. This is the premise on which a lot of market benefits are prioritized, right? Because it says that more writers can be accommodated on our side of the house because there are literally more ideas to write about. This comes clearly in Robin's speech that the market is literally capped because there are only very few ideas that exist on earth. This brings us to the second idea, and broadly everything related to money, everything that's capitalistic. DMU is symmetric is the strongest foot that Gov has and comes in Gov's speech. But realize you run out of, even if DMU is symmetric, the time span or the time length of it is very different. You will run out of ideas faster on your side of the house because we have told you how the comparative operates. The Hindi, postcolonial literature arena is different, the Gujarati one is different, the Bengali one is different. And since there was divide and rule which was enforced on us, we think there's an inherent sense of wanting to assert cultural superiority in these ways at any given point of time. So what happens is you're restrained by geography, you're restrained by culture and things like that. On the comparative, you can write about any particular culture because all of it is encompassed in the idea of Indianness at any given point of time. You can tell your interpretations of what a foreign culture looks like and why there was apprehension in approaching it in the first place. We think the venue of ideas and the amount of them are incredibly more on our side of the house. So even if you milk it to death, there is no avenue or no scope to go ahead and explore. There is a cap that you hit. I don't see when that cap hits on our side of the house. But lastly, even if it is true that I go ahead and milk certain stereotypes, we have told you why consumers force you to create your own identity. It's true for legacy incentives because you don't want to be the secondary I am ABC or the second or the Indian version of ABC and things like that. Will simply not be remembered and it's not in your own incentives. We think you want to become relevant, you want to sell more, and for all those things you have to do that. The third thing that they say is that look, you cannot ever write of Indian things like Jallianwala Bagh for foreign writers. But this is what we have been telling since 3 speeches, right? We think if someone has characterized Punjabiness in a different, specific way, we think we use that element and we expand the scope of what it can become on our side of the house. But on your side of the house, it's severely constrained because you simply can't conceptualize around that idea. I don't realize why people will stop reading the book as soon as they hit Jallianwala Bagh. I think they can Wikipedia it. I think the context will be given in the novel itself. But lastly, why do they use outrightly on a separate metric? They never deal with the idea that on a principled level, the comparative that they're pushing is very fragmented. And if Shashwat's opening lines are true, that this is a sense of finality and this period is that of urgency, we think the narrative should be one that's more unified and one that people can access even if it takes 10 to 15 years of educational facilities at any given point of time. That's why we win.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. The independent metric that they push is not really a metric. I don't understand why people asserting their own identity in their own unique ways is bad. Why is fragmentation actually a harm when people can express themselves in the truest possible manner? Why do I need to conform to everyone? I don't want to understand because I think those people will never relate to me in any way or form. They don't tell us why fragmentation is bad. They just say that it's a problem. I don't understand why it's a problem. They don't tell us what the impact of fragmentation generally looks like when they are literally a diverse country that really people celebrate their own festivals also. Does that mean that's fragmentation? I don't see why every Hindu has to celebrate Ramzan or why every Muslim has to celebrate Diwali for them to conform to each other. I think that can exist symmetry. I But I'll note, this debate cannot exist if all they want to talk about is profits, markets and DMU. Because every market in the long term self-regulates itself. On our side, if you write in your local language, and this is what they say, that's not Hindi and English, but literally all their benefits stand on English being the tipping point. If that's the idea, then all markets will self-regulate. In the long term, everyone will have an incentive to change the way they write. Everyone will have an incentive to change the way they consume because DMU applies symmetrically. That means this debate cannot exist on long-term market dynamics because everyone will have incentives to change. This debate exists in the short term when you go ahead and you exoticize something, you attach a premium to it. That means a lot of people have to conform to that standard because that's what's selling currently. I think they can't go ahead and say that we also gain the benefits of market and profit while symmetrically saying why not a lot of people opt into it in the first place, right? If people believe that this is something that gives them profit, we tell you that the conformism idea stands even stronger because now we have added incentives to conform to whatever's selling in the first place. That means they'll go ahead and opt into whatever is the dominant narrative, which is like, stereotyping Indians or stereotyping their culture in the first place, and they'll sell the same thing. The problem that they don't go ahead and trade off is how you legitimize the kind of stereotypical narrative that exists by foreign authors. Robin's idea is that foreign authors and English idea exist in both worlds. This is the exact problem. They exist in both worlds. Where don't you legitimize it, or where do you create a counter narrative for it? On our side of the house, when you write in local language, even if that debate is not that, even if you don't exoticize this thing, not a lot of people will opt into it, of course. I think that point of time, you probably will not legitimize it to the greater degree on their, which exists on their side of the house, because now you're writing the same thing that those people want in the first place. They can't say the short-term DMU also applies, and then say in the long-term people will also have symmetrical preferences. Because I think those two things literally can't exist at the same time. I think it's simply that this debate becomes about one, where can you create a counter narrative? This is like science own metric. I think it's very simple. The only way you can create a counter narrative is by not conforming to whatever the hegemonic standard that have been set by these people is onto you. I think that's generally like a benefit. But secondly, I don't think they ever engage with the incentive that we gave at second speech of why you want to create language in your own literature in your own local language. We told you why you want to create a community around you of a similar kind of people who share the same kind of language. We told you in second speech onwards, three skills they don't respond to it. But secondly, we've also told you that people when they see appropriation to the large scale of their own language, they want to get counter narrative to it by expressing in the most truest form possible, which is literally their local language. That itself acts as incentives for you to go ahead and break the cycle of what's being exposed to you to a greater degree. And if the last idea is that how do you enter market, that's like counter narrative is probably definitely one. Like the idea of how you enter the market, there are two options. One is you opting into English, second is probably you opting into your local language. I think opting into English means that you can never, and this is something that's true for on either side, you probably can't reverse the kind of image that you create for yourself. So if you opt into English, this reversal is never possible, but also perpetuate stereotypes that are people forced onto you. And those reversals are literally impossible to go ahead and take back. I don't think they ever deal with that idea. On our side, even if this market does not sell the product to a great extent, even if this literature does not sell, doesn't give you the immense amounts of money, I think it's generally good because it retains the purity of that particular narrative. That itself is the most important thing because it allows people to express themselves in the purest form possible. I think all of Robin's idea of English education coming about and all that jazz is literally not required in this debate, or probably not going to be important, because if English language was to come about, I think everyone just literally starts writing about English. Why do we need to exoticize this in the first place? This debate literally happens when a lot of people, even status quo in India, do not have access to English language. I don't think it's a universal language for rural Indians. That means what the most vulnerable people want is something that they can relate to directly, that exists only in our side of the house and not in theirs. For all those